Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling U.S. presidential election.
Oh, this is going to be good.
But, not your typical boring history lesson. We're going deep into some of the most memorable U.S. presidential elections.
Right. The ones that had people glued to their radios, their TVs, on the edge of their seats, like, what is happening?
Exactly. Elections that made history, sparked controversy, some were even, well, kind of weird.
Totally. And you know what's so interesting about those elections?
What's that?
They weren't just about picking a president, right? It was more than that. They were these pivotal moments in American history when the whole country was wrestling with big questions like, who are we? What do we stand for? What direction are we headed?
You're right. It was about those big ideas. And get this, we'll be looking back at these elections, some going all the way back to the 1800s,
Wow.
to see how they connect to the debates we're having right now about how we elect our leaders.
Yeah, like the Electoral College, how much power the media had.
Exactly. How much influence does the media actually have?
It'll be fascinating to see how those dynamics, how they've changed over time.
But before we jump into all that, let's quickly recap how the U.S. election system works.
Right, because it can get a bit confusing.
Totally. The Electoral College, everyone's got an opinion on it.
For sure. So it's not a simple popular vote like, the person with the most votes wins.
Right.
Each state gets a certain number of these things called electors based on how many people live there.
Right.
And usually whoever gets the most votes in a state, they win all of that state's electoral votes. It's like winner takes all.
And that's where things get interesting or controversial, depending on how you look at it.
Oh, definitely, because it means you can actually become president even if you don't win the popular vote.
Yeah, didn't that happen like 5 times in U.S. history?
5 times. And we're going to get into some of the big ones, like, remember the 2016 election? Donald Trump won, even though Hillary Clinton got more votes overall.
That one's definitely going to be talked about for years to come.
Oh, absolutely.
And then there was the 2000 election, Bush versus Gore.
Oh, man, that was a nail-biter. Came down to a few hundred votes in Florida. Ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Talk about a close call.
Really shows how much each vote matters, right? And how this system can lead to some really, really close and contested results.
And even further back, the 1876 election, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden.
Ah, yes. That was wild. Hayes became president even though he lost the popular vote. There were these disputed results, accusations of fraud. The whole thing was a mess. They had to set up a special commission just to figure out who won.
It's kind of crazy how these elections from so long ago still feel relevant to what's going on today.
Totally. It's like the past is never really past,
It just keeps coming back around. Okay, so we've talked about the Electoral College and all its drama. What about the media's role in all this?
Yeah.
They've always had a huge influence on how people see things.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And sometimes they get a little ahead of themselves, before all the votes are even counted.
Yeah. That reminds me of the 1948 election with the whole Dewey Defeats Truman headline.
Oh, yeah, that famous photo.
Truman holding up the newspaper that wrongly declared his defeat.
Newspapers back then, they were a powerful force, and they were sure Dewey was going to win.
Big time. And yet, surprise, Truman pulls off this incredible upset. It shows you that even the media can get it wrong sometimes.
Big time.
Fast forward to 2016, the whole media landscape is completely different. Social media is everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Spreading information, but also, unfortunately, a lot of misinformation.
Right.
That election really highlighted how technology has changed the game. It's like we have access to more information than ever.
Right.
But it's also easier to get manipulated and fall into these echo chambers where everyone just agrees with each other.
It's a tricky situation, right? Like a double-edged sword. We got to be super careful about what we believe.
More careful than ever, especially during elections. Okay, so beyond the whole Electoral College thing and the media's influence, we also have to remember that these elections were about real people.
Of course, they were about the candidates themselves. Their backgrounds, their personalities, all of that played a role.
And how those personalities clashed. Take the 1960 election,
Yeah.
Kennedy versus Nixon. It was the first time presidential debates were on TV.
Oh, yeah. Huge moment.
And the contrast between the two candidates, it was striking.
Absolutely. Kennedy, he was so young and charismatic, and he just looked so comfortable on camera. Then you had Nixon. He looked, I don't know, kind of nervous and sweaty.
It might seem superficial, but those debates really showed how important image and presentation are in politics.
Oh, totally. And don't forget, back then, Kennedy being Catholic was a big deal.
Oh, right.
Lots of people were worried about what it would mean if a Catholic president was elected.
It shows how the social and cultural stuff happening at the time, it all feeds into how people vote.
For sure.
And talking about candidates who broke the mold, what about Trump in 2016? Zero experience in government.
Yeah, that was definitely different.
There's a huge departure from the norm.
Big time. The only other presidents who came in without any elected experience were Eisenhower and Hoover.
So Trump really shook things up. His lack of political experience is a big talking point.
Huge.
Some people loved it, saw it as a breath of fresh air. Others, they were worried, thought he wasn't qualified. It's interesting how those different viewpoints played out on Election Day.
It definitely adds another layer to the whole thing, doesn't it?
It does. And you know what's striking me as we go through these elections? There are all these parallels and themes that keep popping up in different eras.
It's true. History doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes.
Like, think about the lock her up chants directed at Hillary Clinton in 2016. That kind of tactic, it's not new. It's been used against other candidates throughout history. It's all about tapping into people's fears and prejudices.
Yeah. You see the same strategies coming back again and again, even if they look a little different each time.
And another thing, these post-election disputes and legal challenges, we saw it to 2000 with the Florida recount, again in 2016, and even more recently. It makes you wonder about the whole voting process.
It's a big question, right? How do we make sure every vote is counted accurately and fairly? How do we balance speed and efficiency with making sure everything's legit? These are questions that have been around for as long as America has been having elections.
And they're still relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. These historical elections, they give us a way to understand what's going on today.
They remind us that becoming president, it's rarely a smooth ride.
Definitely not.
And it often reflects what's going on in society, all the anxieties and the changes happening beneath the surface.
That's so true. Yeah, it really is amazing how much we can learn from looking back at past elections.
It's like history gives us clues to understand what's going on in politics today.
Totally. And you know, we've been talking about how those big personalities, the candidates themselves, really shaped those elections.
Yeah, their backgrounds, how charismatic they were, even their, flaws.
All of it becomes part of the story. And you know, it's interesting to see how different candidates handled all that pressure.
Yeah, being in the spotlight,
Yeah.
everyone watching you.
It's a tough job. Some people, they thrive under pressure, but for others, it's like they just fall apart.
Right.
We're bombarded with information from everywhere.
It can be overwhelming trying to figure out what's real and what's not.
And the 2016 election, that
Yeah.
was a turning point.
It was. Social media was everywhere.
It was, and it played a huge role, not just in spreading information, but in shaping how people saw the candidates, saw the whole election.
Right. It gave a voice to people who hadn't really been heard before.
That's true. But it also made it easier to spread misinformation, to create these echo chambers where people just hear what they want to hear.
It's a tough balance. Like you said before, it's a double-edged sword.
It is. So we have to be really careful, more careful than ever, about what we believe, especially during elections.
We can't just take everything at face value. We have to think critically, check our sources.
Exactly. So we've been talking about all these memorable elections. What are some of the big takeaways you see? What can we learn from these historical events that might help us understand politics today?
One thing that really stands out to me is that there's no clear path to becoming president.
Yeah, it's definitely not a straight line.
We've seen how the Electoral College can throw a curveball, how a candidate's personality can really sway voters, and how the media, well, they have a huge influence on how people see things.
Yeah, for better or for worse.
For better or for worse. It's a reminder that elections aren't just about picking a leader, they're about so much more.
They are. It's about who we are as a country, what we value, what kind of future we want.
Exactly. And those historical elections, all the drama, all the twists and turns, they show us just how important it is to be involved, to be informed, to make our voices heard.
It's about participating in our democracy.
Exactly. So what do you think? Looking ahead to future elections, what can we learn from the past?
Well, we know how complex this whole electoral process is, how influential the media can be, how important a candidate's story is.
Right.
How do you think all of that is going to play out in the years to come?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it seems like all these trends we've talked about, social media, how divided we are as a country, how much people scrutinize a candidate's personal life.
Right.
It doesn't seem like any of that's going away anytime soon.
Definitely not. So it's crucial for us to understand these historical patterns, how they've shaped our political system, and to have these thoughtful discussions about what American democracy should look like moving forward.
It's about being aware, engaged, and informed.
Absolutely.
You know, it's amazing how looking back at history can help us understand what's happening in politics today.
Oh, totally. And it makes me think about something we haven't really talked about yet, like the impact of social movements.
Oh, right, like how they shape
Hmm.
elections.
Exactly. Think about the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, even like all the activism happening on social media today.
Right, those movements have really changed things, haven't they?
They have. They force candidates to pay attention to issues they might not have cared about otherwise.
It's a good reminder that elections aren't just about the candidates themselves or the political parties.
Right. It's about the people, their hopes and fears, what they want for the future.
It's like we're trying to put a puzzle together.
I like that.
You have all these individual pieces, the candidates, the campaigns, what the media is saying, but it's only when you see the bigger picture, the historical context, that it all starts to make sense.
And that's why it's so important to understand history, right? It helps us zoom out and see how all these elections fit into a bigger story, a story that's still being written.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into U.S. presidential elections, what are some questions our listeners should be asking themselves as they follow future elections?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think it's important to be aware of, like, whose voices are being heard and whose voices are being silenced. What are the stories, the narratives that are shaping the debate? And how are those old power structures, the things that have always been there, how are they influencing what's happening today?
Those are great questions to think about. It reminds us that we're not just watching this all happen, we're part of it.
Absolutely. We have a role to play.
Yeah.
And by understanding how the system works, how the media influences things, how a candidate's personal story can impact the outcome,
Right.
we can become more informed, more engaged
More
citizens.
effective citizens, too.
Exactly.
Well, it's been fascinating exploring all of this with you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into some of the most memorable U.S. presidential elections.
It's been my
We
pleasure.
hope you've enjoyed it and that it's given you a better understanding of what shapes American politics, both in the past and today.
Absolutely. And we hope it encourages everyone to stay curious, to keep learning, and to engage in these important conversations about the future of our democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for listening, everyone.